Okay, thank you. I want to make just a couple quick announcements before we get into the subject at hand. Um, I don't have anything to do with Sattler. My daughter went here for a few months, but she dropped out to get married. So objectively, let me just say a few things. I really value what Sattler's doing here. If you or other young people that you know are looking for higher education, this is a fantastic place to be. You can see the facilities. It's a wonderful opportunity to have students here, and we're very excited about that potential. Secondly, one of the projects of Sattler, since you all are young students, at least for this week, is the Historic Faith project. And what we're doing, what Sattler is doing in collaboration with Scroll Publishing and David Brousseau, hopefully you're familiar with his content, is they're putting together teaching programs online where you can go through a series of messages. It's going to grow. It'll have a growing catalog of. It's a subscription service to have access to those teachings put together in a format with testing, so you actually go through a whole course of all the things they put together there. Some of this stuff will probably be on here. We talked about it. Likely Finney's will be, at least, and probably Dean's. So those are avenues for your continuing education after you leave here. Okay, now I was recently alerted that there are debates about yesterday's topic. I don't want to address that today because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time already. I may have to turn today into two messages, which I wasn't planning for, but we'll see how far we get. But before I get on to today's, one thing I was thinking about putting things together today, it occurred to me that I don't feel like I properly made one of my main points that I wanted to articulate yesterday, and that one of the major takeaways from Jacob's life that I failed to notice and I want to highlight is that for all of the problems in Jacob's life, the takeaway is keep going forward. Like for all of his inconsistencies and problems and failures, the continuous direction forward is what ends up redemptive in the end. And so I don't feel like I dealt with that explicitly enough, so I just wanted to leave that there for you to consider about the things that we talked about yesterday. Okay, so on to today. Today we're going to talk about Joseph. And there's some very specific reasons why I want to talk about Joseph, especially after talking about Jacob. When I think of Joseph, if I could give him this one title, it would be the problems of potential. What do I mean by that? Here's a quick outline of Joseph's life. There's so much content in Joseph's life. I just want to put this up here for you to run through a quick sketch in your mind and familiarize yourself with the arc of his life. So he's born, he gets his coat, he has his dreams, he's sold by his brother, then there's Potiphar's house, then he goes to prison, he gets out with the dreams of the butler, then Pharaoh's dreams, all that, he ends up being in charge of Egypt through the famine years. The brothers come down and see him, he makes the deal with his brothers, they come back, he tricks them with the cup, and then he reveals himself to his brothers. Just so we're all on the same page, so I can just move kind of freely back and forth through his life when we're talking. And then he dies and wants to go out of Egypt. So the most interesting thing, let's for the sake of catching up with the text here, let's start in Genesis chapter 37. It says that, "And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan." These are the generations of Jacob. "Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report." So he's a goody two-shoes. He's narking on his brothers. Probably doesn't make him... Now, I assume that he's just a good boy, and he wants to do what's right. There's probably some early impulse towards doing the right thing, as we see played out in his later life. So I don't mean to disparage Joseph about this, but the point is clear enough. That doesn't make you friends with your brothers when you're always telling dad what they did wrong. So this is our introduction to Joseph. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children. It's also not good for domestic relationships, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Now that's interesting to me, that it's such a curious detail with so little explanation. Like, what are we supposed to make of this coat of many colors? Why? Why a coat of many colors? And what does that signify? And what does it mean? And what does it mean to us? Well, there's a few things. Don't criticize me for this picture. I don't like it. It's just the only one that wasn't from a coloring book. It is multicolored. I think this is actually supposed to be Jesus. It's got flags and stuff in it. It's weird, but it's different colors, and from a distance it looks like just a coat of many colors. So one other thing about this coat is that it's obviously a sign of favor. I mean, it's right there in the text. He loved him more than everybody else, and he gave him this coat. So he's most of a man. He's 17 years old. He's traveling around. He's dealing with the shepherd stuff. But he's also a little protected and insulated, right? Like it's the brothers out, and he's kind of sent on errands to go check on them and come back. I think it's probably the case that Israel is keeping him close. Probably the sons of his favorite wife, Rachel, are especially dear. So it's a sign of his favor. It's also a sign of uniqueness. The fact that this has multiple colors instead of just one bright color or no color, which would be the most common kind of clothing. The fact that it's got not just color, but many colors is a significant fact. It's not normal. Those colors, I think we can take as an indication of potential. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that that conceptually, this coat of many colors means he could go anywhere and do anything, that it could fit into any environment. And that's what the sign, the emblem of this coat of many colors is. Because we think of clothing, and not just us, this is, I think, a human concept around costume and clothing, that clothing fits the man, right? So, if you see a badge and a uniform, you know what kind of person that is. If you see a chef's hat, you know what kind of person that is. If you see nurses' scrubs, you know what kind of person that is. Clothes fit the person. They're a way of identifying roles and status and position. And the fact that Joseph has this many-colored coat means that it's significant that he could be anywhere and do anything. There's an unlimited range of potential that exists in this boy. And so when Israel looks at his son and he thinks, what am I going to put him in? Am I going to put him in shepherd's clothes or some purple robe or what am I going to do? Let's just blend it all together and give him a coat of many colors, and he can go anywhere and do anything. That's, I think, Israel's hopes in the coat of many colors. And what that should signify to us, what it has potential to instruct us in, is that this is a statement of our potential. So like when I'm standing up here, you're not actually wearing a coat of many colors, but you have the same kind of like broad spectrum of potential. The people in this room are many colored. Like you have life in front of you that can take you here or there or anywhere in between. And there's a full range of potential. And this is how we can look at our lives in sympathy with Joseph. That your time, your zeal, your energy, your youth is your coat of many colors. It's the thing that you have that allows you to go in any direction. It makes you potentially multifaceted. And I think that one of the important things about thinking about your life that way is that you're probably capable of much more than you think you are. And I don't mean that in any kind of flattering way. What I mean that is that humans can do much more than they think they can. And if you just think about, like if you think about the examples of extremity, you see athletes who push their bodies into these incredible endeavors. I've heard it said, I'm not a track and field guy, never was, but I've heard it said that the Olympic athletes from the 50s look like college trials from today in the same venue. Like pole vaulting in the 50s, what was Olympic caliber competition in the 50s is now like high school, college level competition in the same avenue. Because of technology, because of training, because of increased understanding and increased abilities and the ability to just push and refine and specialize, people are just getting better and better at the things that they do. And that's true in a lot of things. So the question to ask yourself about your own potential is, what could you do? Like how many languages could you learn? How much could you write? How much could you earn? What's the potential that's in front of your life? And all of that, that's all chaos. Like it doesn't mean anything until it begins to be applied, until it begins to be pursued, until it moves out of the category of potential and into the category of purpose. Because, any baby could be anything. He could be the next Hitler, or he could be the next Gandhi, or he could be the next greatest fighter or the greatest writer, or every baby has all of that potential. But it doesn't mean anything until the life starts to become refined, until there becomes a purpose behind the life, until here's a focus or a direction that I'm going. I want to be this. I want to do this. I chose when I was a young man that I wanted to have a family. I have 11 children now. I've, to a large degree, succeeded in that endeavor. But that choice was the limitation of a whole bunch of other choices. It was the choice not to invest as much time and energy in career and education and some other things. So you have your own coat of many colors. You have your own set of potentialities. You have your own open, unfettered directions in front of you. And it's up to you to decide what to do with it. It's up to you to determine, how are you going to change that potential into actual? What will your life produce? And that's the theme of this whole week, right? What is our purpose? They talk about, in military training, how you have to, the idea is to run people up against the place where they feel like they can't go anymore and keep breaking that threshold. Especially, specialized training like Navy SEALs and Army Rangers. They run these guys into the ground till they feel like they can't go anymore. And when you feel like you can't go anymore, and then you have to go more, you slowly begin to realize that my line of I can't go anymore was wrong. I can go more. I can go farther. I can do more. And that's something we self-limit ourselves in so many different ways. We do it spiritually, we do it physically, we do it emotionally. I can't take it anymore is the plea of a man at his end, but it's not usually his end. We look at people in prison situations, in refugee situations, in war, in trauma, and all kinds of things. And our normal thoughts about limitation of how much a man or a woman can endure is just usually wrong. I've been in Boston for 6 years, and one of the fortuitous things of my life, one of the providential things of my life, was some friends of mine asking me if I'd ever met this guy, Finney Caravella. And I hadn't heard of him, and they said, well, he talks like you talk. You guys should get together. And it just so happened that Finney was coming out of Pennsylvania when I just so happened to be there. And Dean, you were in that meeting, weren't you? Yeah, I think you were. That was my first meeting with Finney, and I we got to know each other. I ended up moving up here, started the church and everything. So now I've been here with him for 6 years. And I've never known anybody that does as much as him. And it's he's like a scheduling superhero. The fact that he does so much, like I know the guy doesn't have any more hours in his day than I do, but he does 5 men's worth of work and doing, like he's running his business, he started in running Sattler, he's doing church work, he's got a large growing family. Like it's really, when I think of this principle of someone who, like what you think is your limit is not really your limit. There are real visible examples in front of us. If you're looking for them, they're there. And when you have the access to those kinds of people, look at them and watch them and see how they act and see what they do and see how they accomplish the things that are not average. Because there's something to learn there. You know, the way of thinking about that potential is how much, if you didn't waste your time, if you didn't waste your emotions, if you didn't waste your day. Now that's, you know, sometimes I say I have a lot to do today, I can't, and I prioritize myself and I say, hey, I got to focus, I got to get this stuff done. And what that means is that extras have to go. I can't be bothered with this, I can't focus on that. Here's what I have to get done. And I focus, right? What happens when you do that every day? What happens when you do it every day for a week? And then what happens if you do it every day for a month and a year and 5 years and 10 years? How much more can we get done if we're focused? I don't know what the limit to that question is. I know that there's an incredible propensity for most of us to put other things in the way, and that has to be related to a lack of focus or drive. So how much potential for your life could you realize if you could zone in? If you could focus down? If you could say, here's what I know I want to do or be, and everything that gets in the way of that, I'm not going to give time to. I'm not going to give attention to. But that includes your emotions too, right? Like I'm not going to waste emotions on bitterness and pettiness and vanity and whatever else gets in the way of our detracting our focus from the things that we know are really what we want to be at our core. Okay. Before I move on, let me just say that you should really invest some time and energy answering those questions. I asked them rhetorically, what do you want to be? What do you want your life to be about? And they're properly rhetorical questions, but I think that they should become real questions to you. That you should spend some time, maybe after some of that wrestling with God, spend some time thinking about what the answer to those questions is. Let's go on in the text here. I didn't look at my time. Okay, so there's the coat of many colors. We have all this potential and all this relationship with the Father and the Son. But it doesn't go well. When his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all of his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers. He dreamed a dream and told it to his brother, and they hated him yet the more. And you know what the dream is. They're out gathering sheaves, and his sheaf stands up, and all the other 11 sheaves, they all bow down to his sheaf. In the text here it says, and they did obeisance to my sheaf. That means in our common parlance that the indicators of you worshipped me. Obeisance, to bow down in front of. He's telling his brothers in symbolic form, you guys are all worshiping me. Again, this is not a way to make friends. But that's the interesting thing, right? Because I don't think Joseph's dumb. I'm guessing that he can understand that there's some familial tension, that things aren't all right between him and his brothers. So why have this conversation? It's not just here, because the next one is the stars, and his star is in the center, and all the other stars and the sun and the moon bow down to him. And he tells this one to Dad, and Dad takes the same view. What are you saying? I'm going to bow down to you? I'm going to worship you? Me and your mother also? So why does he bother? Why not keep this in his little head? There's something indicative about this and Joseph's telling of this, that there's something about his faith. There's something about his notion that these things aren't self-generated. They're from God. And since he accepts that these images, these dreams, and these visions are not really his, but they're from God. It's not being made up in his own mind. He makes a distinction between that. And because they're God's revelation to him, he's willing to bear the scrutiny of sharing that vision. And this is true of all the prophets for all time. These are properly prophecies, and we watch the fulfillment of them by the end of Joseph's life. They are prophecies, and they are from God, and they're born out that way. And it takes guts to share a prophecy. That's the ultimate message of the prophets. These people that God specially puts his hand on, the things that God reveals, the people that God reveals things to, are people courageous enough to bear the scrutiny and the hate and the castigation and the social stigma of speaking things that are true from God. That's a risky endeavor. And it's courageous. And I think that's why he does it. It's also interesting to me that these dreams constitute Joseph's continuing fulfillment in what we've already seen played out with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Remember, we talked yesterday about Jacob's ladder, how it's Jacob's involvement and engagement and his own version of Abraham's blessing. It's his partaking in that covenant. And these dreams constitute the same thing in Joseph's life. This is how the vision and the prophecy of what God's doing with the sons of Abraham is being communicated into the next generation, not just through story, not just through landmarks, but through a personal identification with his place in God's scheme of things for his life. It's not just going to the old altars. It's not just Joseph taking his sons and saying, see here, this is where I had the dream. There's the rocks where I laid my head on as a pillow and anointed with oil. There it is. See, we're all under God's covenant. He's going to do this for us. No, this is Joseph's own interaction with that same thing. And this is communicating the same message after every generation. Every subsequent generation has to have their own participation in the covenant. This covenant with Abraham is as ethnocentric as one can be. Like, being the son of Abraham is what it takes to be in that covenant. And in this particular instance, that's a very small number of people. And even at that, they still have to take their own part and have their own place in it. Every subsequent generation. I hope that you're drawing the connections that I'm trying to make here, because we have a covenant too as the church. And our children have to have their own experience within that covenant and with the God of that covenant. You don't get in just because you're born. If it wasn't enough for Abraham's son and grandson and great-grandson, it's not enough for you. You have to come by your own right. You have to have your own experience with the covenant. It's there. It's available for the sons, but you have to have your own place in it. Okay. So he has his dreams, and dad and brothers are both mad about it. They go to feed the flock, and Joseph's sent out to go and check on his brothers and the flocks. So he's headed out. They're not where they were supposed to be in Shechem, and they're down in Dothan. And Joseph heads down there, and here's what happens. It says in verse 18, and when they saw him afar off, this is his brothers, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him and cast him into some pit. And we'll say some evil beast has devoured him. You know the story. And I think it's interesting that they use this pejorative. They say the dreamer's coming. And I hear that same kind of comment reiterated from time to time. Except for we don't use the word dreamer, we usually use the word idealist. Oh, you're just an idealist. You just got your head in the clouds. You're not one of us. You're not really grounded. I've been told that over the course of my life. I'm guessing you probably have too, Dean. I can almost hear him saying, here comes that dreamer. I can tell you something as having had some part in this pejorative, this rebuke. I don't regret any of my dreams. And I, as an older brother to you younger brothers and younger sisters, I want to encourage you to be dreamers. I want to encourage you to have dreams about what the world can be and your part in it. I want you to have as big of a vision as you can. I want someone in your life to tell you, shoot for the stars. Do as much as you can. Like there's this whole message about potential and actual, this whole week, all this, at least as far as my part of it's concerned, is to push you guys and say, you can do way more than you think. There's so much that needs to be done. I think that the reason that God calls his people through these kinds of visions and these kinds of big, grandiose, even if they're not your own visions, but the ones that are in the scriptures, like the kingdom of God as a concept. Why is that so big? Why aren't we just told, hey, be a good person and live? The kingdom of God is supposed to be something that's in front of us. That's this passion and this center and this focus that you should have all kinds of dreams about, all kinds of desires for. You know, we have a lot of engagement, discussion with people about, you know, the things that Jesus taught us to do. And when I talk with people about like non-resistance, for instance, I have a lot of conversations with people, skeptical people and people that believe in that principle. And Jesus gives some examples there, right? He says, if any man smites you on your right cheek, turn to the left also. If any man sues thee at the law and takes away your coat, let him have your cloak also. If any man compels thee to go a mile, go with him twain. And my punchline, whenever I talk to anybody about that principle of Jesus, is that those are just examples. There's an almost infinite number of ways to obey that principle. It's supposed to mean all kinds of things in all kinds of situations. And one of the biggest limitations that we have in actually making a difference in the world is how shallow our thoughts about the teachings of Jesus are. How very few things it actually touches. that we aren't spending near enough time and energy trying to figure out what's the most creative way that I can manifest that truth. How can I become a vehicle? What conflict can I engage in to change the dynamics of the world? Don't have any less of a hope than that. Because what I am strongly committed to is the idea that if we are non-resistant, obedient Christians only to the extent that we are actually changing evil into good in the world. For all the thoughts that I have, and for all the sermons that I give, and for all the teachings that I go through about Jesus telling us to love our enemies, I'm only actually obeying that to the extent that evil is coming towards me and I'm turning it into good. Where its real effect is happening in the world is really the only gauge that I have of whether or not I'm actually being faithful to those teachings. Because they're not in a vacuum. They have to have an effect. And so what am I saying? So if I'm not being persecuted and thrown in a prison, I'm not a faithful Christian? No. Here's the point. That teaching has everything to do with my whole life. It has to do with when I have business problems. It has to do when I have conflict in the church. It has to do with when I'm having trouble with one of my children, or my wife and I aren't getting along. It's touching every place in my life. And so where I'm faithful, those problems are being taken in and born and converted into love and goodwill. I'm owning the pain of it and not turning it back out. That's the extent to which I'm faithful to those things. That's true with any principle in the kingdom of God. It's true with our economic teaching. It's true with our divorce and marriage teaching. It's true with everything that Jesus taught us has that kind of real world practical result. Do not ever content yourself to be a Christian who believes things that don't have real world impact, that don't change the space around you. Because everywhere Jesus went, the one thing we know he did was change the space. So be an idealist. But that doesn't mean it's easy. I make no claims that won't cause problems and that it won't get you into trouble. In fact, I think I can promise you, if you do those things, it will cause trouble. Like here. Verse 23. And it came to pass when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty and there's no water in it. And, he's barely spared this. They were going to kill him. And his brother was a little nicer than the rest. And he said, hey, we could make some money here. Let's just throw him in a pit. And then the caravan comes and away he goes. And Joseph is off to Egypt. And this, for me, is where the story actually gets interesting. Because it's a little bit weird and it's a little bit mystical up to this point. This is the most practical part of the story because, through one means or another, we all end up in a pit here or there in our life. And the question that we can ask ourselves from this really graphic example in the lives of those that the Scripture's written about is, what should we do when we're in a pit? What do you do when life is cruel and insufferable? What do you do when you hurt? What do you do when you're betrayed? What do you do when things are really ugly and out of order? See, in this story of Joseph, he's kind of the opposite of Solomon, right? I feel like with Solomon, and especially in Ecclesiastes, it's like God says, okay, you're a man. You have appetites. I'm going to fill every appetite you could possess. I'm going to pour and heap on top of a man more than he could ever consume. I'm going to overflow his cup in every avenue of his life. You're hungry? I'll give you more food than you can look at. You have sexual desire? I'm going to give you more women than you could even touch. You want to know about the world? I'm going to cram your head with so much wisdom. You're going to know mysteries that people don't even have the questions for. I'm going to pour everything, gold and resource and peace and kingdom onto your life, and let's see what comes out the other end. Let's see if hedonism is the answer. Let's see if the fulfillment of appetite will make you finally happy. And here poor Solomon, with his life full and his belly full and his head full and his eyes full, says, essentially, I got nothing. I have everything and I have nothing. That's powerful. But Joseph is the opposite. Joseph is all injustice and all privation and all loss. And he has the opposite reaction. You take everything away from him, he's still full. Take his coat, he's still full. Throw him in a pit, he's still full. Put him in a prison, he's still full. And because he can be full when he's in the pit, when he's on a portico looking over Egypt that he controls, he can also be full. See, this is the real incredible irony. When you can be content at the bottom of the pit, it actually solves Solomon's dilemma. Because now Joseph can ascend from the bottom to the top, and he goes up and down in the ladder, in the hierarchy. He's at the lowest, he's at the highest. He's at the lowest, he's at the highest. And everywhere he is in that range of life, he's the same guy. None of it affects him. He has the same relationship with God. He has the same wisdom. He has the same durable character. No matter what situation he's in, it always works. That's powerful. He responds, Joseph is the opposite of Cain. You know, Cain has all this trouble. Cain feels slighted. Cain feels like, why do you respect him and not me? And responds in bitterness and violence and anger and acting out and shaking his fist at God and everything around him. And Joseph does the opposite. There's no fist shaking down there at the bottom of the pit. There's no, why, God, why? We don't get any of that out of Joseph. There could be some comparisons made between Joseph and Job, but I feel like there's so much cosmic mystery going on with Job's life. It's really supposed to teach us something different. And here's why. Because, you know, Job's involved in this contest that's way out of his pay grade. And it's not really designed to teach us how to live. It's designed to teach us what's behind life. That there's way bigger things going on than we know about. And that stuff is mystery. And I'm not saying that those lessons aren't important to learn. They're very important to learn. But there's not much to do about it. Like, I can't deal with God and Satan's contest. But if we look at the life of Joseph, we can figure out how to act when somebody throws you in a pit. There's things to do in this case. There's a course to follow. There's things that can be done. In Joseph's life, we learn what's greater than circumstances. Pop quiz. Who knows who this is? Anybody else? Who is it, Uriah? Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He's a very interesting guy, Mr. Solzhenitsyn. I think he died in the early 2000s, late 90s. He's a Russian writer. But his life is way more interesting than that. He actually fought in the Red Army during the Second World War. On the front lines, he was in a he was in a artillery battery. That's what he was. He was decorated twice as a soldier. He was a captain in the Red Army, and he was very brave. He was, like I said, he was decorated twice by the Red Army with medals for his bravery and for his actions in combat. He also, when he was leading his army, or his part of the army, through Prussia, saw horrible war crimes. He saw Russian soldiers taking out all their vengeance from the German atrocities that had happened against Russians on Eastern European peasants and women and people who were non-combatants. He saw a lot of horrible, atrocious things. And then, as a soldier, towards the end of the war, he was arrested. And he was arrested because he had written something in very veiled terms critical of Stalin. And so he was imprisoned as a war hero. There was a lot of these guys that were rounded up because, you know, soldiers are a problem after the war's over. So there was a purge, even and especially among the military men of the Red Army. And a lot of those guys ended up in labor camps. Alexander was sentenced to 11 years in a labor camp for writing something veiled and negative about Stalin. So they were labor camps. They were horrible. He saw all kinds of atrocious things happen there. Then he gets out. But when he gets out, he's exiled. And in his exile, he almost dies of a tumor. It's not enough to go through prison and war crimes and the horror of war. He also gets cancer. And it becomes, tragedy almost becomes comedy if you're far enough away from it. Like, that's ridiculous. Really? Front lines, through war crimes, into prison, labor camps for 11 years. You finally get out, and then you get cancer. So he almost dies of that. But they allow him out of his regional exile to go to a hospital. And actually, he wrote one of his books about a cancer ward. Then he gets out. The whole time, this guy has a brilliant memory. He wrote a poem with, I don't know, hundreds or 1,000 lines. It's a giant poem. He wrote it in his head. He didn't have paper. He didn't have a pen. So he wrote it in his head and kept it there until he could get out and have paper. His papers and effects were confiscated at one point, so there goes all of his manuscripts. The whole time he's writing a book called The Gulag Archipelago. And it's a giant book. I mean, I have it on my shelf. I haven't read it because I'm not brave enough. But it's a giant book. It's substantial. If you want your library to look nice, get a copy of the Gulag Archipelago. But it's a catalog of the atrocities that happened in the Soviet labor camps. And it was released. So this guy, he's a writer like some people are musicians or some people are mathematicians. Like, writing just comes out of him. He can't help it. He's doing it in prison without paper and pen. He just can't help but write. It's what he does. And remember. Those are the two things that Solzhenitsyn does. He writes and he remembers. And so this stuff is just pouring out of him. He's a natural-born writer, and he can't get anyone to publish his work because it's all too controversial. Finally, the Gulag manuscript gets out. He has some friends, I think, that were in... where were they? Were they in Estonia? I'm not sure. He has some friends somewhere in Eastern Russia that start typing out his manuscripts. It's a huge volume, and he never has all of it in front of him. As soon as he gets a part written, he gets rid of it so that it doesn't get confiscated. So finally, all of it gets put together. It gets printed in the West, and it's a damning revelation of how horrible the Soviet Empire is. Finally, he gets a book published. Khrushchev himself had to sign off on printing Solzhenitsyn's first book that was published in Russia. If you don't know who Khrushchev is, that was the prime minister of Russia at the time. So the president had to give the official okay to print his first book that was printed there. And it sells like hotcakes. He finally has the popularity that he always should have had as this natural-born writer. He since the 1920s, it's kind of the first book with any kind of political thrust that's printed in Russia. So he has this rise to popularity, and then Khrushchev is dispossessed of his place, and now he's back under the thumbs of the state. And then he's actually kicked out of the country. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for literature at this time, right after his first work is published, for the Gulag. And they want him to come and collect his prize in Switzerland, but he's afraid if he leaves, they won't let him back into Russia. So he can't go pick up his Nobel Peace Prize. He stays there. And then after the trouble that comes from the publication of Gulag, he actually gets exiled out of Russia, comes to the West. But it's not over. Like the KGB tries to assassinate him. They send him ricin in the mail. It almost kills him. So this is the life. And why am I saying this? And there are other examples I could have picked. This just happens to be a pretty good one. The things that he wrote when he was meditating, he becomes an Orthodox man, an Eastern Orthodox man, and he said that the things that have happened to our country have happened because we forgot God. That's his indictment of Marxism and Russia in general. But he says this, he's able to write this: "Bless you, prison. Bless you for being in my life. For there, lying upon the rotting prison straw, I came to realize that the object of life is not prosperity, as we are made to believe, but the maturity of the human soul." That's a pretty impressive thing to get out of prison. He also said this: "There's nothing that so assists the awakening of omniscience, the awakening of all-knowing, within us as insistent thoughts about one's own transgressions, errors, mistakes. After the difficult cycles of such ponderings over many years, whenever I mentioned the heartlessness of our highest-ranking bureaucrats, the cruelty of our executioners, I remember myself and Captain's shoulder boards in the forward march of my battery through East Prussia, enshrouded in fire, and I say, so, were we any better?" Do you see the lack of bitterness and the owning of empathy? The lack of wanting to take it out on someone else. Now, it doesn't change any of the facts of his life, right? It doesn't change any of the facts of Joseph's life. But there are just two different ways that people respond. It's the dua via. There's the way of life and the way of death. And there's these two ways that we're going to respond to any pit in our life. You either ball up your fist and you get mad at God. Now, here's the problem with me saying that. Because none of you will probably ever actually ball up your fist and scream at God. But people do that in 1,000 different ways in their life. I've been wronged. I don't deserve this. This shouldn't be my lot. Is all the same as shaking your fist at God and saying, why? And I think that that's a natural response. I'm not calling it anything else. It is natural to have been thrown in a pit and to say, why? This isn't where I should be. It's natural if you get cancer to feel like you got a bum deal. It's natural if you're thrown in prison as a war hero to feel like that's not where I should be. But when you're there, what do you say? Do you say, why? Or do you say, what could I do? See, I think that the fascinating thing to me about the life of Joseph in general is that it answers the question of in any given horrible situation, how much can you make right? Like, how much of a potential is there in the lowest spot in your life, how much could be fixed if you just decided to fix it? So for this guy, sitting in a Siberian work camp, instead of shaking his fist, he says, am I any different? What about me? Who sits in a Siberian prison as a war hero, decorated, and says, what's wrong with me? What have I done? Why am I here? What's God trying to tell me? How could I learn from this? What can we change? That's the other way. That's the lesson of Joseph. What is the other way? How much could I fix? Okay, I'm in prison. What can I do to make it better? And this is why I think Joseph is such a spectacular example, and other men who have done similar things, is that they embody this notion that there's something totally apart from circumstance. That there's something within men that has the potential to overcome any circumstance. That everything can always be made better. What if your child's sick? Well, how do you make that better? What if your father dies? Well, how do you make that better? What if you lose your job? Well, how do you make that better? What if you have a disability? Well, how do you make that better? What makes a hero? Heroism. What is heroic? Heroic is the acceptance of a suffering existence. It's heroic to be able to say, suffering is a given. Things go bad. There are many times that life doesn't work. And you either fight against that or you accept it. And if you accept it, if you say, this is, then you can move on and say, what can be done? But it's that fighting against what is. That's the essence of bitterness. That's the essence of that shaking the fist at God is, I don't want this to be. This can't be. That's what people say. This can't be. Well, it is. It is. It's heroic to say, in the worst circumstances that you ever face, I know that things could be made better. It's the bottom of every hero story that's told in all of human history. Oh, there's an insurmountable army, there's an insurmountable famine, there's an insurmountable, everything's broken, nothing's working, we're all going to die. Well, we can do something. That's the subtext for every heroic tale that's been told in human history. Something could be done. It's in Roman mythology, it's in Viking mythology, it's in the Bible stories, it's in everywhere. The hero always says, we can do something about this. And if you've had to wrestle in your life with those pit experiences, I dare say that you've maybe learned, but maybe you haven't. Maybe it was a horrible trial and you're still reeling from it. But if you want to mark those times in your life and prepare for them in the future, get ready to have an attitude that says, we can do something about it. That there are resources. Now, what do you do? I don't mean that problems aren't real. Please don't misunderstand me and think that I'm trying to say we can have this naivete that just thinks everything is okay. I'm not talking about thinking that everything is okay. I'm not talking about willful ignorance. I'm not talking about ignoring real problems. I'm actually talking about the opposite. I'm talking about when there are real problems, looking them full in the face and saying, we're going to do something about this. We're going to accept this problem and work through a solution. We're going to find a way. And I don't know of anything in the human condition, death itself, that can't be handled in that kind of perspective. We're all going to die. So what? So what do we do about that? Do we ignore it? Are we just putting it as far out of memory as we can? Are we just trying to... here's what most people do. You just try to live your life with enough distraction that you don't have to think about that until it hurts, or until you have to deal with it, or until you show up at a funeral, or until the doctor tells you you have cancer. You just try to go to enough baseball games and listen to enough music and play and make enough money and have enough distractions and buy a boat if you can and go out to the lake on the weekends and ignore the idea that someday your life is going to end. That's what millions and millions of people are doing. Or you look at it as the great tragedy. I want to address this later, but I'm going to deal with it now since we're on the subject. I don't think that Joseph in the end says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. That there's a way for Joseph to play the narrative of his life. When he looks back, when he sees everything that happens, he has the same perspective from the pit as he does when his brothers are bowing in front of him finally at the end of his life. He has this consistent feeling the whole way. God's doing something through this. God's doing something through this. God's doing something through this. That's the thing that controls his narrative. And I think that there's a counterfeit to that idea that God meant for good. The counterfeit to that idea is actually the Islamic notion of inshallah. God wills. The determinism that says God is pulling all these strings and making these things happen is not the same as God meant these things for good. Because God meant these things for good means he's shaping something out of this. Even the tragedies in my life are being used to create something. They're like a hewer's hammer. He's smashing things to create something. He's carving like a sculptor. He's cutting like a carver to take out the parts that aren't right. And it's redemptive, that there's a purpose behind these things. And that's not the same as capricious. That's not the same as unknowable determinism. Because see, people tell me, I talk to people, I have a friend, an old family friend, and she went through a lot of crisis in her life. And people were dying, and she was unmoored in the world, and she didn't know how to deal with all this. And then the few people that were giving her some kind of compassion and counsel also died, and she has herself just reeling. There's another girl. She was abused by her mother, and then abused by her father, and then put into foster care and abused. And I knew her in her young life, and I knew she was a tragedy. And I used to cry over her. My wife and I, we tried to take her, we tried to help her, and we just couldn't. It didn't work, and I knew this was just a horrible situation. And she reached out to me later, and she says, oh yeah, that guy that was abusing me and molesting me, he's in jail. And she reaches out to me from time to time, and I was like, oh, that's so horrible. And I told her, I said, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And she said, well, God knows. It must have been meant to be. And I told her, I said, no, that wasn't God's will. That wasn't meant to be. That wasn't supposed to be. That's not what God wanted. That's God's enemy. See, when Jesus is headed towards Lazarus, towards the tomb, right? He says, he knows what's going to happen. They come and they say, Lazarus sleeps. And they're like, good, he needs a nap. And he says, no, Lazarus is dead. And I'm glad for your sakes. He already knows what's going to happen before he even gets there. Why does he show up and cry? Why does he show up and wail in grief? Why does he shed tears with Mary and Martha? Why does he groan in his spirit when he stands outside the tomb? It's because that's his enemy. That's what he came to fight and crush and destroy. That's the problem. And this is what I'm talking about, the difference between inshallah, between God wills and God has a purpose, is that God's coming to fight and to war and to change and to fix and to heal and to conquer death. And the narrative of Jesus' life is to go down into death, to destroy it, to break it open, to unlock the doors, and to set everyone free. And that's not the same. That's power to set things right. We don't always get the whole arc of that. Sometimes our people, they die on crosses, or they die on pyres of fire, or they're fed to lions, or they rot to death in prisons, and they don't get to see the whole arc, but they're in the part of it. They're making up the whole arc for all of us. And the way to redeem these things, the way to make the tragedy useful, is to have the place where you say, I'm going to do everything I can, and I'm going to trust that there's something leading me through all this. That there's a purpose, that this isn't capricious, it's not without purpose, it's not without function. I'm not just adrift in the cosmos on a spinning ball in the middle of space, left to my own devices to suffer or succeed. That God is with me and working with me, and if I do my part, I can find my way through. That's how you shape character and integrity. It's how you figure out how to fix things. You know who a hero is? A mother with a sick baby is a hero. Watch a mother with her child in pain in her arms who can't do anything to fix it. But be there and try to help and try to comfort and hold and care. And accept and not get bitter and not think that the world is unfair, so that when the child finally wakes up, when he finally is okay enough, that he has a loving person there to play with him. And when you spend every night up all night with a sick and crying child, how do you get up the next morning and play and read stories to the child? Those two ways. One way is to shake your fist at God and say, this shouldn't be happening. I don't know how to deal with this, and it's more than I can handle. It's beyond my limits. I can't do it. And if you take that attitude, if you allow place for that, then you'll be right. And you won't be able to handle it. And you won't be able to get up the next day. And you won't be able to laugh anymore. And you won't be able to play. And everything gets worse. The hero says, I'm going to do what I can. And there'll be tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll do what we can again. And every day we'll fix everything that we can. How much can things be improved at any given moment? Joseph's life is an example to us. Like if you look at him as an emblem, as a archetypical figure, as someone who's laying out a pattern, the question we can ask ourselves is, how should the maze of life be run? When you run into the dead end, when you went the wrong way, when you have to double back, there's a maze in front of you and you're lost in it. How do you get through? And the way you get through is like Joseph. You say, oh, here's the dead end. We got to turn around. And you keep going. Keep going. It's the same thing I started this morning talking about Jacob. Keep going. These men are hard creatures. Those brothers of Joseph, it's not enough that they sell their brother. It's not enough they hate them. You can almost sympathize with them for hating Joseph, right? Tattletale, bratty little brother, always making trouble, always getting in the way, always dad's favorite, always blah, 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 telling us we're going to worship him. You can understand why they hate him. But the treachery doesn't stop, right? They sell him, and then they practice the same kind of treachery on their father. I don't know how to tell how much that's Jacob's sowing from his reaping still going on in his life. Probably shouldn't be ignored. But that's really cruel. You bring back a bloody coat. Show it to your dad about his favorite son. Can you imagine calling your mom tonight and saying, hey, there was a car crash, my brother's dead? Just kidding. Not really. That's an incredibly cruel, treacherous thing to do. So off Joseph goes. This betrayal, I was thinking about, and these aren't all my thoughts, but there's something different about betrayal, right? Like it's a different category of catastrophe. It's one thing if there's a tornado and it sweeps your house away, or if there's a flood, or if there's a famine, or there's some pestilence, or you die of cancer or whatever. That's hard. It's things that have to be dealt with. But betrayal's like a different category of catastrophe. And there's some reasons for why that is. When you think of family, when you think of the people that are close to you, there's something that we do that we shut down our skepticism of people that are close to us, right? So if somebody is in my family, the same kind of, like when I meet somebody for the first time, I have all my antenna up, right? Like, who are you? What are you? Are you honest? Are you true? Are you faithful? Are you dangerous? Are you what? What are you? And all that is, we have all of our social customs designed to deal with that, to figure out who each other are in time and space, and how should we relate, and should you be that far, or can I let you closer? All that happens in our minds and in our emotions and in our culture without us knowing. It's been developed. You just inherit it. But with your family and with the people that you bring close, you stop analyzing them so carefully. And that's really helpful. Like, you don't have to always second guess people's motives that are in your family. You just begin to, that's what trust is. I don't have to scrutinize your every word. I can just take you for granted that you mean, when you say you love me, you mean that. You're not trying to get something from me. You're not trying to whatever. I just take it for granted. And that's what we do in trust. Well, when you're betrayed by someone who's close, all of a sudden, that didn't work. All of a sudden, your instrument panel that's designed to tell you who is okay and who's not was wrong. And it throws the whole world into chaos. People that have experienced betrayal know exactly what I'm talking about. All of a sudden, it's not just the person that you had problems with. You have to rethink everything from the past. You have to say, where did I go wrong? How did I misunderstand? What are the signs to this that I didn't see coming? And sometimes there's no answer to those things. And it just disorients the whole life. It disorients everything that you've built your whole social framework around. What's trustworthy and what's not? Who do I love and who do I not? Who loves me and who doesn't? Everything gets thrown into chaos. And there in those places are where we're most tempted. This is the backdrop for the pit. And Jacob's mistrust later. He doesn't even know Joseph's alive, but he knows something's fishy, and he's not willing to let Benjamin go anywhere. The choice after betrayal to trust is that same kind of heroic courage. This is the hardest thing to fix after betrayal. For the church, when we encounter someone who's been betrayed, by family, especially by spouses, but also by church. When someone's been betrayed, they're so hard. That's what a brother offended is harder to be won than a walled city. Like when that trust is gone, it doesn't just go. It burns the bridge and the walls and the town, and then it drops bombs on the road. It's very hard to reconnect any kind of structure around someone who's been betrayed. So there's two things that I want to point out from that. Don't betray people. Right? Don't do that to people. What does it mean to betray someone? It means to take advantage of their trust. And maybe you're saying, well, there's not a whole lot of real world problems with that. I'm not planning on betraying anybody. But we do betray people. Gossip is a betrayal of trust. When you know something about someone and you go share that in other places where it doesn't belong, that's betrayal. When you practice lust, that's a betrayal. You're taking advantage of someone else for your own good. They're not insignificant things. There's a 1,000 little betrayals in people's lives. And we justify and we say, well, it's not really, it's a victimless crime, right? Like, who am I hurting? You are hurting. You're hurting people. You're hurting people in the present. You're hurting people in the future. And you're likely hurting people from your past. If you've been betrayed, you have to learn to look at the life of Joseph. If you've been through betrayal, if you've been let down, if you've been hurt by people that should take care of you, if you've been abused by people you trusted, I know why. I know why it hurts. I know why you create defense structures and you build up walls and you say, you stay over there and I'll stay over here and then we'll all be fine. That doesn't work for life. It's an emotional way of saying this shouldn't be. And I'm going to make sure that it never happens again. And you'll wall yourself off into a prison of your own construction. And that's the real tragedy of not responding like Joseph when you're in a pit. Is that when somebody finally comes to try to help you out, you say, you stay out there. I'm perfectly fine in my pit. Thank you very much. It's risky, I know. I know it hurts to open up again. I know it hurts to try to reconnect when things haven't gone right, when people who should have been right, who should have been well, who should have been trustworthy, who should have been caretakers, don't do that. But you can't create that wall and that prison. I don't know who that's for. But for all of us, let's be mindful of betrayal. There's very few things that can hurt people like betrayal. Genesis chapter 39, where are we at? Okay, we got some time still. In Genesis 39, now Joseph goes to Potiphar. And here we see these principles in action, right? Now we see that if you work every day to try to make bad things better, they actually can be substantially improved. And And he works his way up. Well, let's see what it says here. In verse 1, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him out of the hand of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from time to time they made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Well, that's a pretty glowing testimony to this principle in action. That these incremental improvements, that here I am in a pit, but we're just going to make our way one step at a time. We're going to keep moving forward. We're not going to give up. We're not going to throw up our hands. We're going to keep trying to make improvements every day, day by day. We'll keep working forward. Keep taking one step. Keep getting up in the morning. Keep going forward. Keep. And there, what do you know? God blesses that. There's 5 times in the New Testament there's something that is enumerated. It's all in the Synoptic Gospels, all 5 instances. It's sometimes called the Matthew principle. It's known in economic circles as the Matthew effect. Matthew 25 and verse 29 is where it is. It says this. I don't know if you've ever wondered about this when you've read it before, but I have. It says, for unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away, even that which he has. That's really weird. I remember reading that since I was a child, and like, what? How does that even, how can you take stuff from somebody who doesn't have nothing, for one? But why is this? Well, and we see it all over the place. This principle can be summed up in the lament, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time. It's actually a fascinating thing. I would really encourage you to look up some of the work that's been done, because there's actually a lot of research, like I said, this is known in economic circles. It's an economic principle that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's a fact of reality. It happens, and there are some very specific reasons why it happens. But the reason I mention it here is because the fact that it's mentioned 5 times in the New Testament means that it's not just describing a quality of existence. It's telling us to do something with it. That this is a principle that can be utilized and brought to bear in your life. That you're not just supposed to hear this and say, oh, well, that's weird. You're supposed to hear this and do something about it. So, what are we supposed to do? Him that hath shall be given more, and him that hath not, even that which he hath, will be taken away. These things, this way of life that I'm talking about with Joseph, where you say, I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to accept whatever's not right, and I'm going to make as much improvement as I can. And that takes you one step forward, and then another step forward, and another step forward. And as you keep walking forward, all of a sudden you find a tailwind behind you, and God is working in your favor. And I don't mean money. I don't mean whatever weird permutation. I mean the favor of God. I mean that you and he grow and you are blessed in the real things that actually matter. That you find yourself cooperating with God. And I'll tell you what, if you want a clue about finding purpose in life, find the things where you feel like you're working with God. That's purpose. Where you feel like you and God are operating together. That's purpose. And that's the Matthew principle. When you get God, and when you line up with what He's doing, and you're doing what He's doing, that's where things open up. In whatever situation you're in, that's where things open up. That's where things happen. That's why Jesus has to be about His Father's business, because I know where He's working is where I want to be. That's where I want to be. That's where things work. And Joseph is an incredible example of this exact principle. You're in a pit. What are you going to do that's faithful? I'm going to do this faithful thing. Okay? And then these little steps of faithfulness, all of a sudden, this works in reverse, by the way, also. I can remember a time in my life. I remember it very, I don't have a great memory, but there are a few things that I remember very well. And I remember one morning waking up. I wasn't married yet, but I was living with Erica, and we had this little apartment, which was a big success in my life at that point. I had a place to live. And I was sick, and I was hungover, and I was kind of like stumbling around through my house, and I found a cigarette in an ashtray, and I sat down in a chair, and I felt horrible, and I was coughing and wheezing, and all I wanted was a cigarette, and I lit the cigarette, and I sat there, and I thought, I just kind of looked up, and I thought, how in the world did I get here? Like just a few years ago, I was like a normal, middle-class American kid, and now I'm just a mess. And I couldn't even put together the steps from there to here. And I remember thinking, I never thought this was where I wanted to be. And here I am. How's that happen? That's this principle in reverse. That's from him that has not. That which he has should be taken away. Like it just... as quickly, like as unprecedented as these rises are, the bottom just drops out in the opposite version of this principle. And that's something that you can navigate. That's something that you can manipulate in your life. The things that you know that are right, that are honorable, that are virtuous, build those things. And those things that you have and that you master, God will add to. And you'll find more opportunity and better success at the spiritual pursuits of your life. It's a spiritual version of compound interest. Right? Okay, so there we are. Everything's great. And that's an important thing to note. Everything's great. Life has been terrible. He's been in the pit. He's been the slave. He's worked his way up. He's the ideal version of picking yourself up by your bootstraps. Joseph did what he was supposed to do, and everything turned out well. And if the story ended there, that's all we'd have to say about it. But it doesn't. Then comes Potiphar's wife. And there's some interesting things about Potiphar's wife to me. It makes me wonder about what's in Joseph that stops him. Why, when that woman grabs a hold of him, when she entices him and tries to seduce him, what's in him that turns away? Because here's the interesting thing. Virtue is only those things which you could do that you don't. Have you ever thought about that before? See, if you can't do something, that's not virtue. If you're restricted, if you're behind a wall, if you're in an environment where you could not do otherwise, that is not virtue. When something is in front of you that is within your power to do, and you choose not to, only that is virtue. There's actually Nietzsche's critique of morality, of religious morality, is exactly that. That most people, well, he would say all, I would say most. Most people's religious morality is just a cloak for cowardice. In other words, and we hear this often about non-resistance, right? Like, you're just a coward. You just don't want to fight. You're just afraid, and that's why you espouse this principle. And that could be a real possibility for some people. Hiding behind a moral code is different than practicing real virtue. And the difference is in those things that you could do but don't. Right? And here, Joseph could have done something and didn't. His impulse, given his opportunity, is to run away. There's something in him that recoils from the idea. And this is where I think there's something for us to gather out of this notion of Joseph's flight from temptation, is that thing, whatever that is in Joseph that causes him to push her away and run, regardless of the consequence. Like, I don't know how this is all going to turn out. This is not a computational thing. This is a reactionary thing. And that's what's important to this in this story to me, is that he doesn't think about this, he just responds. It's a response. It's not something he's thinking about. It's not something he was planning for. It's not something he was premeditating. When the situation comes up and she grabs a hold and she says, "Come here, young man, I want you," he just runs. And there's something inside of him. And that thing that's inside of him is what he knows he's about. Because that's at his core. He knows who he is. He knows what he's about. He knows who his God is. He's established right from wrong. He's set up his life with God. And that causes, in the face of this temptation, fleeing. There's not here's the alternate scenario. And she says, "Hey, Joseph, come." And he has to think about it, and what are the pluses and the minuses, and what would happen if I was caught, and how is this all? If you're in that place, that's a really, really, really dangerous place. We want to create a life grounded in God, that our responses to temptation is instinctual, not contemplative. We don't want to do cost-benefit analyses with sin. That's a losing game. I wonder how you do that. I wonder how you set up a life that responds to temptation that way. It's a worthwhile question to ask yourself what you think your own limits are. It's probably wrong. Your limit's probably wrong, but it's a place to start. Like, what do you think would be past your limit of temptation? Where do you think you would get into trouble? Why does that constitute a temptation? What's out of balance with you and God that would be the problem? See, the interesting thing here also is that it's not just this woman that's the temptation. There's a secondary temptation, and the secondary temptation is the cost that he's going to pay for not following the temptation. And that's a really subtle power, right? Because, she constitutes one component, but when he runs away, something's going to happen with her. And we know what does happen with her. She grabs a hold of his garment and she says he came in, and he has to pay the price for his obedience. And that price of obedience constitutes a secondary temptation in any given temptation. Because here's the thing, that Matthew principle, your life starts like life, how we started. Life is going really well for Joseph, and all of this gets threatened, not just her, but his new life. And things finally going right are all at stake in this moment. That's why you have to have that reaction. That's why the impulse to do right has to come out in these moments, because if you stop and think about it, even if she doesn't catch you, that problem will. Well, I don't want her, but I also don't want to lose my cush life. Like, things are finally working out for me. I've finally gotten to a place where everything's okay, and I can't jeopardize that. I don't want that to go right. Now, that happens in a lot of ways. I've watched it happen in a lot of churches. A lot of church decisions are made because of how we think this is going to affect things instead of what an essential premise of what's right in this situation. When you're calculating the cost of doing right, you're asking the wrong questions. That's half the battle's been lost. When there's not some guiding principle that says, here's what's right, and whatever it costs to do that, that's what we do. That's the difference between integrity and religious caged morality. You have to know the whys of what you do and what you don't do. There has to be something underneath. You have to have principles underneath your practice. This is from the biggest things to the littlest things. Why do you dress the way you do? Why do you listen to what you listen to? Why do you watch what you watch? Why do you think what you think? Why do you go where you go? Why do you drive what you drive? Why do you do what you do? There should be something underneath all that stuff. There's such a propensity to just go and just do and not ask questions. Ask yourself questions. Plague yourself with the question why about your own motives. Why do you want the things you want? Why do you do the things you do? Why do you dress the way you dress? Plague yourself with the question why. So that when you're in temptation, you know what you're about. It's 3:45. I don't know to go or to stop. Let's just try to wrap up, okay? He goes into prison from this situation. It doesn't go well. He's back in the pit, right? Full circle. How do you feel when you're there? Like, man, restart again? I'm how old? Joseph's got to think all these in prison, right? I'm how old and I'm back in the pit again? I started in the pit and I'm all these years, all this work, all this toil, all my faithfulness, all this, back in the stinking pit. That's the temptation. But that's not the reaction we get from Joseph. It's back to the grindstone. Here we go again. How can we make this better? How can we move forward? Okay, we're in prison. What's in front of us now? This, for me, in studying through the life of Joseph again, this is the one thing that I would love to capture in my own life. This ability to say, how much can I improve things? How much can be set right? How much is not circumstance? Regardless of circumstance, what's left? Whether you're in Potiphar's house ruling or in prison, what's left? That's the essential question of this life. And we're making that same statement about our own lives too. They maybe just haven't been tested yet, but we're doing the same thing. It's just maybe not being realized. But we're building some kind of substance of who we are. And if our situation changes, then what's going to be left? If everything in your life changes radically tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year, what are you? Because we're not our circumstance. That's the underlying message here, right? Joseph is not his circumstance. He's something independent of it. And that's akin to power. If you can be whole, and I think there's plenty of testimony of this in church history, certainly. If you can be whole when everything else is gone, what can be taken? That's the ultimate life. When nothing is contingent on circumstance, whether it comes or whether it goes, you know who you are and what you are. That's the life to focus on, to try to create. So there he is in prison. The butler remembers him. I think that's the end of my slides. I didn't think we'd get this far, actually. But let's fast forward to the end, okay? You all know the story with me. So the famine comes, the brothers come, Jacob sends them down and says, hey, you got to go down to Egypt and get corn. And then he starts messing with his brothers. And I don't mean that in a bad way. He's also emotionally tore up about them. He's crying. He sees that what is all the way back to his youth is coming to fulfillment. Here his brothers are asking him for help, and he knows that this is what's going on here. But there's a certain kind of wisdom in Joseph at this point in his story. He puts out some tests in front of his brothers. When he has a meal with them, right, at the end of this story, he gives Benjamin more food than the rest of them. And he's wondering, he says, he orders them by age, and they're amazed. It says that I forget how it says, but they're shocked that he can do that. They think he's a diviner or something. He orders them at the table, around the table, according to age. And then he has their food prepared so that Benjamin gets more food than anybody else. And he's watching. He's wondering, I've changed. Have they? Are they still the same people that they were? Are they going to be mad at Benjamin that he has more than they do? What's going on here? And then he's still testing this out with the cup. When they come back, they say he says, you have to bring Benjamin or don't come back to me. And they have to wrestle with Jacob and say, no, we got to take Benjamin. And then they finally go back and he gives them their food. And then he puts his diviner's cup in their bag and then he chases them. And Benjamin's got the cup and woe is me. But in that situation, Judah puts his life on the line for Benjamin. Because Joseph wants to know, what are we dealing with here? Who are you? Are you the same guys that threw me in the pit? Or something changed? What's going on? And there Judah is saying, take me. Let him go. It'll kill my father. And this is too much for Joseph. He weeps. And he says, everybody out. And he reveals himself to his brothers. And this is where we get this amazing statement from Joseph. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that good, here's an important caveat to that good. That good, he sums up as, I have provided life for many. It's not good for him. It's been good not for him, for his family, because now they have sustenance and corn in the famine, and also for the whole nation of Egypt. Joseph recognizes his place as a little cog in God's plan to better everyone's life, not his. God meant this for good, to preserve life for many. And you can see through his whole life, from the pit to that moment, how much of a pure purpose that Joseph has for his life. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there, and maybe let's have a word of prayer, and then we have enough time we can ask a few questions, if there are some, from yesterday or today. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this opportunity to look at your word. These lives, they're amazing to us. We are so grateful that over millennia, you've saved these things for our instruction and our edification. We want to get everything that we can today out of these things. We want to recognize the necessity of our lives and the lateness of the hour. And Father, there's so much for us to learn. We want to be whole. We want to have the kind of life that you make exemplary. We want to mirror your teachings and the virtues that you lay out. And we want to avoid the pitfalls that you show us. Make us wise, Father. I beg you, for these young people in this room, I pray that you'd make them wise. Give them a heart and a life and a purpose like these men. In Jesus' name, amen.